Hey, what's happening, DC Going viewers? It is me, the DC Going One, and welcome to the video. Today marks the 20th anniversary of Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins, a film that, while receiving critical and audience acclaim when it released, has since been overshadowed by its sequel, The Dark Knight, and has seemingly been forgotten for just how much it influenced the superhero genre and revolutionized what a superhero film could be. While I agree that The Dark Knight is the better movie, Batman Begins deserves to be recognized as a significant milestone in the evolution of how superhero movies are viewed by both Hollywood and audiences. In this video, we'll be looking at what Batman Begins did differently than previous superhero movies, and how it redefined how comics were portrayed in film for the next 20 years. Keep in mind, the last live-action Batman movie before Batman Begins was Batman and Robin, which is not only considered the worst Batman and comic book movie of all time, but also one of the worst movies of all time. You could argue that Batman and Robin epitomized comic book movies at their worst, and damaged the public perception of superhero movies for a long time. It was up to Batman Begins to get audiences, specifically adult audiences, back on board with comic book movies, and somehow convince them to take them seriously. And the way it went about it was actually kind of interesting. Before Batman Begins, no other Batman movie, or even show for that matter, really took a look at Bruce Wayne's transformation into the Dark Knight. Almost every Batman adaptation up to this point begins with Bruce Wayne already being well established as Batman, and the adaptations that did cover Batman's origin tend to jump from Bruce's parents being murdered straight to him being Batman, with the years in between often being ignored, or if they are addressed, they're usually summed up as time spent training and learning skills to become Batman. The only Batman movie that actually provided a look at this span of time was Mask of the Phantasm, but even that movie mostly skimmed over that part of the story and mostly focused on Bruce's personal life during that period. Batman Begins was the first Batman movie to show the process of Bruce Wayne becoming Batman, and not just in his martial arts training, but the evolution of his mindset, his skills, and his presentation. The fact that we don't see Bruce in the complete Batsuit until about halfway through the movie was a huge departure from how previous superhero movies were structured, which tended to show the costume in the first 30 minutes. This approach of showing the development of the character and their persona has since become the standard in subsequent comic book movies, as opposed to them starting out as the version of the character that the audience already knows and is expecting to see. Batman Begins also integrated ideas from the comics that had never been addressed in a Batman movie before, especially not to the extent that they were in this movie. Specifically, the idea that Bruce Wayne is the alter ego, and Batman is the character's true identity. Bruce even tells Rachel that the egotistical playboy that he has seemingly become since returning to Gotham is an act, and a mask that he's putting on to hide who he really is, which Rachel doesn't buy. The concept of Bruce Wayne being the mask that Batman wears is well known to comic book fans, and something that multiple Batman stories had played with before. But it was surprising to see it presented in the first installment of a new Batman series that was trying to get mainstream audiences back on board with the character. It feels like a surprisingly deep cut to pull from the comics, and immediately establishes that the film recognizes that there is more to the character of Batman than a masked vigilante who beats up criminals in colorful costumes. While previous pieces of superhero media like Batman the Animated Series, Justice League, and X-Men the Animated Series regularly handled more mature themes, they were still viewed as kids shows by audiences, and it was hard to get adults to even give them a chance and watch them, and even harder to get adults to watch them long enough to take them seriously. Before Batman Begins, superheroes were still mostly seen as kids and family entertainment, and it was still seen as nerdy to be a full-grown adult who was really into comics and superheroes. It wasn't until Batman Begins that the stigma of superheroes being for younger audiences was truly broken, and that comic book characters and their stories could genuinely appeal to mainstream adult audiences, a change in mindset that would greatly benefit future comic book movies and projects like the MCU. Even with the financial success and praise for the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies and the X-Men movies, which were coming out around the same time, they were still seen as comic book movies first, and the visuals and stories reflected that. While these films had more complex characters and more mature themes than previous live-action superhero films, they still featured characters with superpowers wearing brightly colored spandex costumes. The story in the world of Batman Begins was much more grounded and realistic than previous Batman and other comic book movies. The costumes and gadgets were toned down and reimagined with the perspective of what they would look like and how they would function if they were real, a mindset that has continued to be used in comic book movies and shows since then, leading to the gritty realism of the Matt Reeves Batman. Everything about Batman Begins is taken seriously, and it doesn't include that much comedy like other superhero movies. While other superhero movies at the time threw in jokes throughout, to a varying degree of success, the occasional comedic moments in Batman Begins came from witty exchanges and offhand comments. that are more akin to things that would be said in real life.
Spelunking.
Yeah, cave diving.
You expecting to run into much gunfire in these caves?
This is something that the first Iron Man movie picked up on and integrated with great success. A subtle sense of humor that recent Marvel movies have been criticized for failing to capture and trying to force. Even though Batman is already one of the more realistic comic characters, as he and most of his rogues gallery don't have superpowers, the plot of Batman Begins is still much more grounded than previous Batman movies. For comparison, the plot of Batman and Robin saw a bright blue evil mad scientist with an ice-themed persona and a plant woman with the ability to control nature work together in an attempt to wipe out all humans by using a giant ice gun. Meanwhile, the plot of Batman Begins saw a secret militia group attempt to commit a citywide genocide using a chemical weapon, as a means to remove the corruption and crime that had become ingrained into Gotham City. The villain's plan being based on goals that reflect that of the heroes, with the conflict stemming from method of execution and personal values, kicked off an evolution in how comic book villains and their schemes are portrayed in movies, beyond the traditional takeover or destroy the world plan. While comic fans were aware of the depth and complexity of a lot of these characters, it wasn't often portrayed that well in movies. This more complex portrayal of a comic book villain has since become the standard, arguably culminating with Thanos in the MCU and leading to the whole villains who were right discussion, something that wasn't really seen in previous comic book movies, which tended to present a very clear distinction between good and evil and right and wrong. Another thing that Batman Begins brought to comic book movies was showing the value of going deeper into the roster of characters within a franchise. For one thing, having Ra's al Ghul as the evil mastermind and main villain of the story was a risky move when trying to appeal to general audiences. Usually when a new Batman series is started, the people behind it use one of Batman's big villains like Joker, Penguin, Catwoman, or Riddler. These were the villains used to introduce the 60s show, the Tim Burton Batman, Batman the Animated Series, the Batman TV show, and especially Matt Reeves' Batman, which used all four if you count the deleted Joker scene. So to start this new Batman series with Ra's al Ghul, a character that most general audiences would be unfamiliar with, that doesn't have the same selling power of a character like the Joker, was a bold choice. And the success of the film and the positive reception towards Batman Begins' portrayal of Ra's showed studios that using lesser-known characters can still be financially successful and received well by audiences. Before Batman Begins, could you imagine a film studio in the early 2000s taking a risk of pouring millions of dollars into a movie about characters like the Guardians of the Galaxy, Shang-Chi, or most recently, the Thunderbolts and Sentry? Since Batman Begins, comic book movies have dug deeper into their universes and used increasingly more obscure yet interesting characters that have rarely been used in previous adaptations and depictions, especially with villains. In addition to using a lesser-known villain, Batman Begins' inclusion of characters known almost exclusively by comic book fans also led to more obscure characters being used in other comic book movies to fill out their worlds. Characters like Joe Chill, Carmine Falcone, and Victor Zsasz not only being present in the story, but named, a detail that would likely mean nothing to non-comic book fans, opened the door for more deep-cut characters like Happy Hogan and Ned Leeds to be used in place of more well-known characters that are constantly used, creating a greater variety of characters, relationships, and storylines. Speaking of pulling from the comics, Batman Begins also showed future comic book movies how to use storylines from the comics and integrate them into the plot of the films. Before this movie, the only thing that comic book films really pulled from the comics was the characters themselves, and then created an entirely new story to put them in, once again to varying degrees of success. There were very few comic book movies that used storylines from the comics in their plots. The only comic book movies that clearly took story elements from the comics was the '89 Batman movie, which pulled its inspiration for Joker's origin directly from The Killing Joke, and the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, which referenced Gwen Stacy's and Green Goblin's death in the comics in the final confrontation. The plot of Batman Begins obviously takes a lot of inspiration from Batman Year One, but it did it in a way that the movie wasn't just an adaptation of the graphic novel. It was its own story that simply took inspiration from Year One, taking some elements from the story and adding its own to create a new story. We've seen this done in many comic book movies since, probably most notably in Captain America: Civil War. Batman Begins' greatest achievement is re-legitimizing comic book movies and comics themselves as an art form that goes beyond something that's just for kids. It showed mainstream audiences, and more importantly studios, that there was more to comics than spandex costumes and big fight scenes, that there was a maturity and complexity to these characters and their stories that should be acknowledged and respected when portraying them in film, and not relegated to brightly colored campiness like they had been in most depictions up to that point. Batman Begins also succeeded in reinventing Batman for a new era, and overcoming the perception of the character created by previous iterations. People seem to forget that Batman wasn't always the super cool, dark, and brooding vigilante that we know him as today. That was actually a relatively recent change to the character's persona, and even more recent when Batman Begins came out. Batman is a character who can actually easily be seen as silly, like a lot of comic book characters when you actually take a step back and look at them with fresh eyes. I mean, Batman is a guy who dresses up in a costume that is meant to make him look like an animal while fighting crime, and names all of his things after bats. It wasn't until the Bronze Age in the 70s, and even more so in the Dark Ages of the 80s and 90s, where Batman and his stories took on a darker tone that have since defined the character. Before that, Batman and comics as a whole were much more lighthearted, mostly due to the strict guidelines around depictions of violence in comic books at the time, due to the Comics Code Authority. This was a Batman who fought aliens, robots, and dinosaurs on a regular occasion, and got superpowers after traveling to the planet of Zur-En-Arr. This was a Batman who would wear a bright blue costume and a big smile while teaming up with an interdimensional imp and riding around in the Whirly Bat. For a lot of adults in the early 2000s, this is what they thought of when they thought of Batman, because this is who the character was for, at the time, the majority of his run. Batman Begins was able to overcome all of that, and show the world that this is a character to be taken seriously. That these are stories to be taken seriously. That this is a medium to be taken seriously. And because it succeeded in doing that, comics and comic book characters are now some of the biggest franchises in pop culture history, across all forms of media, and dominate the box office every year. And ever since, comic book projects have continued to take on more serious tones and mature themes, and their stories have pushed the envelope beyond what anyone could have imagined could be done with these characters. And now the idea of comic book movies having Oscar-worthy performances, something that would have been laughable before, is no longer that far-fetched, and has actually since happened multiple times. I think Batman Begins has a lot to do with that, because once you can get Batman right, everyone else then wants to try their hand at it. But let me know what you think. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more videos.